wanna know, I'm Alexis, aka the Sloth Reader, and I'm here today to do my March wrap-up. In March, I read a total of 9 books. 3 of those were audiobooks, 1 of those was an ARC, and 2 of them were 2 books off of my top 10 to read in 2018 list. So I'm very, very happy with the progress I made in March. And if you'll remember from my TBR, I set out to read only literary fiction this month to try and tackle some of the literary fiction books I had in my TBR. I did do that with the exception of reading 1 nonfiction and 1 YA book, and the YA book was a huge buddy read I took part in. So I'm really, really happy with how this month went. So we'll just go ahead and get into it. The first book I'm going to talk about was my least favorite book of the month, and that is Call Me By Your Name by Andre Aciman. Of course I picked this up because everybody and their mother was talking about it, so I decided to go ahead and pick it up. I ultimately ended up giving this one a 2.5 stars. It was just okay for me. I didn't think it was as great as some people were saying, but I didn't think it was as terrible as other people were saying. The one huge drawback for me was that the main character, Elio, is recounting the story of his first love years in the future, and so a lot of the things he says are very hypothetical for what he was thinking at the time, and that kind of got confusing because sometimes I didn't know if things were actually happening or if things were just happening in his head. So there were a couple of times while listening to that I did get a little confused, which is why I gave it a 2.5 instead of a 3. I also do want to mention that in this book both Elio and Oliver are Jewish and bisexual. Those were 2 representations I had known about previously going into the book, so I figured I would let you guys know. The other thing I do want to mention about this book, because I feel like people approach this book wrong, and I also did that. This book I feel like is so heavily pitched as a male-male romance, and I don't feel like that's the right mindset to go into this book, because I don't really think that this is a book that presents you with a romance that you're gonna root for, that you're gonna fall in love with. I think this is more a story about Elio's feelings and nostalgia and misinterpretation of his first love when he was 17, because to be honest, Oliver, his love interest, can be kind of a jerk to him, but Elio constantly romanticizes that, and I think it's more to show the flaws of Elio's first love, you know, show that he was naive and innocent and he really didn't know what these things were supposed to feel like, so he couldn't recognize them for being as bad as they were. And I felt that was more the point that Andre Aciman was trying to make, as opposed to like, look at this romance, love this romance. So that was my interpretation of the book. The next book I'm going to mention I buddy read with my friend Rami. I will leave her blog link down below, and that was The Mothers by Britt Bennett. Ultimately, I gave this one a 3.5. I loved the writing. Britt Bennett tells the story in a unique way from a group of old ladies in this church community, and like their interpretation of the story going on and the insight they have to give, and I really liked that perspective. And I really liked some of the poignant and thought-provoking statements that Britt Bennett writes throughout this book on race and on society's expectation of women and stuff. Like, I loved all of that. The part where this novel lost me is that I never really felt like the characters were very unique. They never felt like they were jumping off the page to me. Ultimately, I feel like in 6 months I'll forget them, and so that was the reason this one got a 3.5 for me, but I'm very, very excited to see what Britt Bennett is going to write in the future, because I loved her writing style in this. The next one I'm going to mention is The Song of Achilles by Madeline Miller. I gave this one a 4 stars. This was one of my top books to read in 2018, so I'm so happy to have finally read this. I loved the setting of this book. It's no surprise that I love the Iliad and I love anything Trojan War related, so the setting and cultural subtext of this novel were totally up my alley. That was by far my favorite part. I also loved that this book is written from first person, from Patroclus's point of view. I think that was a very strong choice on Madeline Miller's part, because we got to learn who Patroclus was, and we get to see how empathetic and kind-hearted and brave in his own way he was, and I connected strongly to that and to his character. But I also love that we get to see how Patroclus thought of everything and how he felt about Achilles, rather than just seeing Achilles as the legend as we know him. So I loved the decision to write this book from Patroclus's point of view. But as much as I loved the first 100 pages and as much as I loved the last 100 pages, The middle portion of this book was very slow and very boring for me. I felt like nothing was really happening. I felt like the scenes on Skyros and with Datamea easily could have been condensed into half the amount of pages they were given. So for me, that dragged on a little bit too, but ultimately I do think this is a great read. I do kind of already want to reread this because I already am like longing for more Trojan War fiction because of how much I just love that in general, and this is like the only book I know that gives those vibes to me. So if you have more historical fiction set during ancient Greece, please recommend it to me because I'm thirsting for it. The next book I'm going to mention is another one I listened to on audiobook, and that was The Secret History by Donna Tartt. I ended up giving this one a 4 stars as well. This is another one for me where I loved the first 75% of this book, and then I felt like the last 25% was really weak for me. I understood what Donna Tartt was going for in that having the last half kind of be messy to like mirror the fracturing of the friend group in this story, but it wasn't successful for me because I felt like characters were having the same conversations over and over again. I felt like things and interactions and thoughts were happening that weren't leading the story anywhere. And ultimately, I have to admit, I was kind of disappointed by the ending, so that was pretty much a bummer. However, I will say that the thing I love the most about this book is that this is not a book about bad people. This is a book about people who make bad decisions, and I loved the idea of morality in this book and how the characters, especially Richard, the main character who was my favorite in the book, watching him grapple with morality and the people around him and their varying thoughts of morality. And so that was really, really fascinating. I do know a lot of people kind of claimed that it was pretentious, and for me that felt very intentional because you're reading the book and you're basically reading about a bunch of kids who are pretentious. They're an elite group of Greek students, but I think Donna Tartt writes them that way, and I think her writing style reflects that, is that you're supposed to be reading this book going like, what are these pretentious kids getting into? And that's kind of the vibe you get from the book, from Richard's narration. So I think that for me really, really worked. So I did read this month. I enjoyed reading it. I gave it a 4 stars. I think it's a strong book and I would recommend it. The next book I'm going to mention is Bygone Badass Broads, 52 Forgotten Women Who Changed the World by Mackenzie Lee. This is a collection of 52 basically short mini entries about women from history. I really enjoyed this. I really liked Mackenzie Lee's writing style. It's very Twittery. It's very much how she presents herself on Twitter, which I really liked. I loved the illustrations in this. I thought they were awesome. My favorite illustration was this one for Commander Liwewe, but a lot of the illustrations in this were really strong, and I loved learning about the women in this collection because so many of them were so interesting. Prior to picking this up, I only knew about 10 to 15 of the women included, so I loved that there was a lot of really unknown women. My one complaint, and the reason I gave this 4 stars, is because I wished more of an effort would have been made to include trans and non-binary women. There is one trans woman included in this list, Angela Morley, and there also is King Christina of Sweden, who was non-binary, included in this. But 2 out of 52 for me is kind of weak, and I wish more of an effort would have been made to include more non-cis women, just because I feel like on the whole their stories are definitely forgotten. So that is my one complaint, but otherwise I did think this was a fun little collection. The next one I'm not going to spend too much time talking about because I do have an entire review I plan to film for it, and that is Fury Born by Claire Legrand. I gave this one a 4 stars, and I thought this was a really strong start to a new fantasy YA series. I will link everybody I did the buddy read with down below so you can check that out, but I really enjoyed buddy reading this with all of the fantastic women I read with because we all really enjoyed it and we were all having so much fun coming up with theories. Some of the strongest perks for this book for me is that this is told in 2 points of view, and I found both points of views interesting the entire way through, and I flopped on which one was my favorite, but I never really lost interest in either one. This book also takes place 1,000 years apart, so it was so interesting to me to see the differences in this world and how they had changed. and like what ultimately causes these changes in this society. That was so interesting to me. The reason I did give this 4 stars rather than 5 is because I did think there were a couple of characters who did act inconsistent in some points. Especially towards the ending for me. One character in particular like did a complete 180, and so that for me was very confusing because I was like, what? And then the other one is that one of the points of views for me ended very lackluster. I kind of was disappointed in the way that their story ended in this book. However, again, I think this is a great start to a new series. I'm so excited to read the rest of the books when they come out. This goes on sale May 22nd, and I highly recommend you all check it out when it comes out. The next book I'm going to mention is my last audiobook listen for the month, and that was The Color Purple by Alice Walker, and I loved this book so much more than I thought I would going into this book. This book is so sad, but it's also so hopeful, and you're following the main character, Celie, and like, she is such a resilient woman. She goes through so much, and she never really gives up hope that things are gonna get better, and that is so incredible to read. Celie also is a lesbian, and she has a relationship with a woman, and reading that just warmed my heart. And of course, Alice Walker writes this entire book in letters, and I loved that choice, that vignette style for this book. I thought it was so successfully done because it helped move Celie's story along, because this book takes place over the course of her entire life, and it helped to move the story along without it feeling too overbearing in certain parts. So I loved that decision. I also loved what Alice Walker had to say about this time period, and obviously Celie being black in the South in the 1930s. It was such a unique voice, and it was so successful for me. I loved Celie's character so much, and I like felt so bonded to her by the end of the book. It was so good. I loved this book. Like, I'm so upset I never was made to read this in school, because I thought this book was incredible. It totally deserves to be a classic and to be well loved and widely received. It was so good. I ended up giving it a 4.5 stars. Only reason I didn't give it 5 stars is because there is a point in the story that does follow another character. Some of those chapters for me were kind of slow. They kind of felt like they were removing me a little too much from Celie's point of view, which I hated because I loved Celie's point of view so much. But other than that, I loved this book. I thought this book was so incredible. Getting into my 2 5 stars of the month, the first one I'm going to mention is Stay With Me by Ayobami Adebayo, and this book totally took me by surprise. I picked this one up because a lot of reviewers I trust had loved it and rated it 5 stars, said it was one of their favorite books of last year, so I decided to give it a chance, and I'm so glad I did. This book was such an emotional roller coaster. Like, I was furious one minute, I was like holding back tears the next, I was ready to throttle characters. I loved it. It was so good. This book is set in 1980s Nigeria, which I loved the perspective of because Adebayo does go into a lot of the political turmoil of that time, and I loved how she paralleled it to Yejide's story. And of course, I loved Yejide as a main character. I felt so much sympathy for her and her story as she was going through everything she was going through. And this book has so much to say on women's role in reproduction and how society views them and how society blames them when they can't reproduce, and how society basically reduces women to tools for procreation. And like, it was so profound in some parts when Yejide was struggling and nobody had sympathy for her, and it was just, oh my gosh, it was so thought-provoking and it was so feminist, and I loved this book so much. It was so good. I highly recommend checking this one out. I gave it 5 stars. It was like incredible. An emotional roller coaster, but it was incredible. The last book I'm going to mention, my favorite book of the month, is one that is very hyped up right now, and I'm here to tell you that I unapologetically think this book is worth all of the hype it's getting, and that is The 7 Husbands of Evelyn Hugo by Taylor Jenkins Reid. This book, let me just explain to you guys, I tab occasionally, I tabbed this book up because I loved it. it like pierced my soul. It was so good and so profound in what it had to say about feminism and how society treats women and how society treats bisexual women, because the main character is bisexual, and how society views the queer community because so many of the characters in this book are queer. And the main character, Monique, is biracial, and she talks about being biracial and how she feels that has affected her life. But this book is also about love and ambition and making decisions that aren't necessarily right but are the best for the people you love. And oh my god, I don't want to say too much because I just think that this book is wonderful. I think it's a masterpiece. I cried so much while reading this book, while reading Evelyn's story, that I just, oh my god, I loved this book. I don't know what else to say because I don't want to say too much because I don't want to spoil it, but I also just think that everybody should read this book. This is going to be my 2018 recommendation right here. If you read anything I recommend in 2018, let it be The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo, because this book was phenomenal. Alrighty guys, so those are all of the books I read in March. I'd also love to know what is your favorite book you read in March. You can leave that down in the comments below. If you like what I do, I upload videos on Monday, Wednesdays, and Saturdays, and I'll see you guys soon with another video. Bye!